Do I seem like a Bob or a Dan?
Well,
No.
kind of, but you could be a Phil. I could see you being a Phil.
What? Oh, no.
Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm BB Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Brotherless Night.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
You say your name is Whitney, but what if I decided to call you something else?
Well, first of all, most people don't believe that my name is Whitney or that I could be a man named Whitney. So I'm fairly used to that, you know. But what do you got? What do you got for me as an alternative name?
I'll have to come up with some options if I can get you to reply to something else.
You don't have anything? Like Bob? Do I seem like a Bob or a Dan? No.
Kind of, but you could be a Phil. I could see you being a Phil.
What? Oh, no.
When I was a kid, people would sometimes try to anglicize my name without my permission. That's a pretty common Asian American experience, maybe even specifically South Asian. Like, can I call you Susie? I'd be like, no,
Oh.
you can't. You can't.
Has that happened recently?
It's been a long time since anyone has tried that with me. I think maybe it's clear now that it wouldn't go over well.
Or not, because it seems like we're regressing a little bit on the naming front. Trump has renamed the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America.
And Denali is now Mount McKinley. And people keep asking me, like, can he do that? And it seems like what he can do is direct our federal government to use those names. And Google Maps has caved and they're doing it. And even the Associated Press is apparently changing its style.
And those are just a couple of examples. Politico is reporting that the president wants to change Fort Liberty back to Fort Bragg. And Bragg, the reason that name was changed was that Bragg was a Confederate general, and seditionist, and person who tried to overthrow the government. But what the hell?
And
Let's go back to it.
I think in general, when people try to overthrow the government now, we just pardon them.
That's right.
Anyway, at this rate, they're going to have to redo all the maps. How do the names of the places we live and travel matter? What do they mean about how we imagine ourselves? In today's episode, we're going to unpack names and maps and how they matter in the company of an author whose new essay collection touches on those subjects. Thomas Dai is the author of Take My Name, But Say It Slow, an essay collection published by Norton. Born and raised in Tennessee, he now lives in the Northwest, where he is an assistant professor of English at the University of Idaho. His writing has been supported by scholarships and residencies from the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, Lambda Literary, Playa, and the Sewanee Writers Conference. His essays have appeared in the Brooklyn Rail, Conjunctions, GLQ, Guernica, Literary Hub, the best website, New England Review, The Rumpus, the Yale Review, and elsewhere. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here, and thanks for having me here to talk about my book.
We're glad to have you here. Your collection is a memoir of sorts about your life in different places, and you think deeply about the importance of the connections between names and places. Were you surprised by, we're here in the first weeks of the Trump administration, were you surprised by Trump's moves to rename places like the Gulf of Mexico and Denali? Why is that such a priority for him, and how does renaming a place change how we imagine ourselves in relationship to that place?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like it's hard to be surprised about anything now, but I think on this particular point, it's also just not surprising to me. I think for two reasons. Partially because changing a name, even something as seemingly expansive as a place's name, it's not like a complicated policy move. You can just do it in many ways. And I feel like if Trump is good at anything, it's sort of these like splashy, news-ready, performative gestures that certainly like gesture to his politics and are important to think about, but like ultimately are also there to just like kind of get us riled up, which it does get me riled up, to be honest. And I think it's also not surprising because as I reflect in the book, place names, even when they sort of recede into the backdrop, I think one of the points I'm trying to make throughout the book is that they're also a kind of contested, they're a topic of political contestation, I feel like. And in the early sort of essays in my book, one of the things I'm reflecting on as someone who grew up loving geography and sort of, immersing himself all the time in maps and books at the same time, is that there really is this kind of coeval relationship between them. And that, like in making a map, you're also telling a particular story and specifically a story about how you want to see the world or what this kind of official view of the world is. And I think, when you start thinking about maps as text, it leads to some surprising, potentially even liberatory things where like, I guess all I'm saying is that it, like it is a two-way street. Like there's ways to also rename that follow one's own political kind of orientation, right? I think of like the queer map. I'm thinking I write about later in the essays, and also about like online maps that sort of obliterate the borders of US political states and show you like the sovereign territories and sovereign names of like the indigenous tribes that used to be there. I feel like the distinction between like what Trump is doing and these kind of more like novel counter mapping efforts is that those renaming efforts, on behalf of like the public, they feel more like annotation. Like you're adding a story to the map and you're trying to add layers to the map to make people more aware of like differences of opinion or different life perspectives that are also contained by that place. And the Trumpian move is it's much more top down, right? And it also just happens more quickly and is
It's
as
also
simple as
very
just,
blunt. It's just as simple as like, we don't like
yeah.
Mexico. We don't like Native Americans. We're going to go back to Gulf of America and we're going to name this mountain after a white president. That's it.
Yeah,
That's
it's
what we're
blunt
doing.
force, and it's a white president who, like, is like Trump, an imperialist and an isolationist at the same time, and they're just going to take that name and put it on the tallest mountain in North America. So it totally makes sense as a maneuver, both in its simplicity and in its like total bluntness, as you're saying.
Problem is, if he's going to take out all the Native American derived names, we'd have to rename all the states.
Yeah, yeah. Or like stop
My
calling it
state would have to be
Manhattan and
renamed.
Appalachia, Mississippi. Yeah, I mean, this is also part of it. It's never as simple as just like flipping a switch or like, there's histories to names as opposed to like, there's never just two, one good one and one bad one.
That's one of the things I really appreciated about the collection, the way that it resisted binaries. And yeah, I think Trump is, aiming at acts of erasure, and the notion of annotation is so much more interesting. And the first essay in your collection, Map Page, had a lot of passages that also made me think of recent headlines. And I wonder if you would read a little bit from it for us.
Yeah, of course. So this is kind of midway through that essay, and I've just finished a little riff on one of my childhood favorite books, which starts with a map page, Lord of the Rings by J.R. Tolkien. The writer Guy Davenport, who once studied under Tolkien at Oxford, claims there is a geography of the imagination that must be considered alongside any geography of cities and landforms, glaciers, and bays. A geography of the imagination would include all those places that underpin our mental lives, places that, for writers and artists, give rise to the settings of novels and the backdrops to plays. When I was a child, any place external to the closed circuits of daily life, the school, the neighborhood, the bonus room above the garage, I thought of as my imagination's domain. I knew these other places to be real, or at least more real than the places I'd found in books. But just like with Middle Earth, I first accessed these places via the representational magic of storytelling, of maps. After the Replogle Globe lost its luster, I begged a subscription to National Geographic off my parents and began devoting much of my locking door time to flipping through that magazine's pages, enthralled less by the articles than by their pictures, which showed me Arizonan cliff dwellings, Indonesian reef reserves, Mexican cenotes, Namibian dune fields, Kamchatkan volcanoes. Each photograph came with a matter-of-fact caption, like, "Women of the Wessex subdivision don tiaras at Bunko Princess Night, a mix of dice game and costume party where moms can let their hair down." Unibrowed with vague concern, I also scanned into my brain National Geographic's coverage of international crises. from America's still young wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to the latest quake in Haiti or famine in Darfur. I had no language back then for the gaze, and did not understand, except subconsciously perhaps, my favorite magazine's editorial messaging. How National Geographic divided an us, the homebound American reader, from a them, the foreign, beleaguered, but somehow attractive other. How it did this by organizing the world into a series of beautiful disasters in my lap. To map a place, to perform cartographies show and tell, one must choose what to include and what to leave out, seeking clarity in redaction. Perhaps this is why geography has long been the province of the surveyors and catalogers, the war makers and orientalists, those who would show the world in order to control it. More personally, I fear that immersing myself in geography has really just been a means of avoiding people, of charting the scene while ignoring that scene's inhabitants.
Thank you so much. I'm so struck by the idea of geography of the imagination and how you connect it to the fantasy maps in books like Lord of the Rings. I, like, as a person, have a very poor sense of direction and also really love looking at fantasy maps and kind of hate real ones, because they remind me that I have no sense of direction. But anyway, you also had a sentence in there about geography being the province of surveyors and catalogers, war makers and orientalists. This is so fascinating to me because I teach at the University of Minnesota. When I
Hmm.
moved here, I had a friend kind of like take me aside and be like, Sugi, when you get there, make friends with the geographers. They're the radicals. Um, right. So, and I've now come to understand that that is sort of a common understanding of contemporary geography. How do you get from there to geography as the radical department?
Yeah, I mean, I should say I'm sort of like I'm not a geographer by training or by
Yeah,
I'm a geographer by interest, right? Like, when I
sure.
was applying to PhD programs, I actually did apply to geography programs and then sort of like ran off into the more like solidly humanities, American studies, English realm instead, because I think, yeah, like I mean, connecting this to I think your insight there. I've always just privileged the geography of the imagination, like the way that like place and identity can come together in this really just playful and like powerfully creative way. Like I feel like that's the core of like my writing in many ways. And what I think I naively sort of always try to ignore, at least growing up, were the political valences to it because it's obviously so political too. And so I think maybe that's I don't have like a actually astute answer to like how we made it from like map making and cartography as sort of a top-down way to organize the world and like put people in their place, right? Toward like thinking about geography in this radical counter mapping sense. But I want to say, or my inkling is that it has something to do with those latent imaginative qualities to thinking about place that, like every map sort of resists its own sense of like limitations, right? Like people are always thinking about the things that are on the edges of it, which like cartographers used to call in a really poetic way, like sleeping beauties, and I feel like that for me is like there's a radical political valence to it, but part of that radicality is also just accepting that like our human emotions, perspectives, and experiences just cannot be put into this container that is sort of the tool of the trade. And so that like underlying contrast, I feel like creates this sort of radical possibilities for geography as I see it, as someone on the outside maybe idealizing and looking in.
Well, I mean, no, I mean, that makes sense to me because if you look at, I don't know, like the old maps that you write about in this section, right? I mean, I also was like a kid sitting in like an office procrastinating from doing my homework by reading National Geographic. And like National Geographic is like it's a colonial magazine, it's like an imperialist, all the things that you say about it. And then there's a certain set of maps, like there are some maps that you can look at the same place over a period of time, and it basically is the story of imperialism. Like it's the
Mhm.
story of like border creep, or like borders coming into existence, firming up, like people taking it over. And now there's sort of this decolonial impulse, which is so much of what I also saw in the way that you were writing about maps. And now, of course, we have Trump talking not only about renaming the Gulf of Mexico, but also just he's like flat out talking about annexing places. Like I can't imagine if you asked that guy to draw a map, what would that look like? Right? There's a section in here where it's like, draw what you remember. Like, what does he would just draw like a whole Earth where everything would just be called Trump. I mean, like renaming in this context seems like a kind of imperialism. And your book is kind of an interesting decolonial response to that.
Yeah, I know. I mean, like, I think to that, sorry, I just got struck by the idea of what would Trump's like mental map look like. And I feel like, this brings in the Gulf of Mexico/America because it'd probably just be like Mar-a-Lago at its center and then like everything else kind of in this periphery being renamed slowly by this creep of Trump. Um, I, I don't want to overstate what the book is doing. Like, I don't think it's decolonial in this material sense. I mean, it's a book, but like, I also mean that in that I'm writing it from a settler perspective, and so I'm kind of grappling too with like my own complicity, not necessarily in the renaming and things, but in being able to live in this country and like benefit from all the things that have been kind of put in place by how it's been mapped and put in place by, this colonial entity that is the United States of America. So I think it's like maybe decolonial insofar as it begs the question of like, what is this thing? And let's not naturalize it as in the United States of America. And you can approach that from a historical lens, but also, as I try to do here, from a personal lens of just trying not to like take it for granted in the way that I always took maps for granted, right? But yeah, I also want to be careful to make it clear that I'm not like charting out a really robust decolonial imagination here. I think in many ways, I'm sort of charting more like the confusion of what it means to be sympathetic to that idea, but to still have to live in our colonial kind of reality, right?
That makes me think of the essay Borderlands Transect, where you're talking about living in Tucson, where you're not from, you were there for an MFA
Mhm.
program, you were new there, you're trying to figure out what it meant like to live close to the border as you were then. Could you talk a little bit about what a transect is and how that essay developed?
Yeah, of course. So I guess the minor backstory to this is I did not study before did an English or MFA program. I had not been like a you know, English major in college. I'd been a biology major. Both my parents are scientists, and that just, in a sort of classic, maybe second gen Asian American way, I kind of just was following in their footsteps as much as I could. But one thing that I learned in one of my classes as a biology student is about this very simple idea of running a transect, which is basically like a field survey technique where a biologist or anyone who's doing kind of land-based research will basically just chart a line of a certain length, a straight line over a particular landscape. And in this essay, I'm thinking about the American Southwest, the Sonoran Desert, and you just walk kind of methodically along the line, and every 5 feet or whatever kind of increment you choose, you stop and you take counts of things. Take stock of what you're looking for. And it's a way of just honestly like quantifying something that's very difficult to quantify, right? Landscape. And so that essay really developed for me because when I was living in Tucson, it was like this, terra incognita to me. And so I sort of leaned on the techniques I learned as a student to try to figure it out. And I wasn't actually running a transect, but in a metaphorical way, I felt like my daily life, just kind of walking around, going to class, exploring like this sort of Western landscape that I'd never really been exposed to. It did feel like I was running a transect, but I wasn't really sure what kind of question I was orienting this transect around. And I think what unlocked that essay for me eventually is obviously in like being in the Southwest, and reading the news, I was thinking about the border and I was thinking about border politics. And this made me, dig a little bit into the history of the border and just realize that how that border came to be was in a sort of similar process, after the Mexican-American War, when we were ceded this territory that had, previously been Mexico. A border had to be assigned, and people did that by basically walking what amounted to a transect. Like there wasn't a line already there. Like they agreed on one and then they had to survey it and draw up maps. And just like I sort of reflect over and over again, that's a subjective process. Like it wasn't like a ordained process, like a Mexican committee of surveyors and an American committee of surveyors had to keep on checking each other's work and deciding, is the line actually supposed to be here or there? And so I think in digging into that history, I saw this kind of curious parallel, and it helped me form the essay, where that transect was formed, as in the border, the literal border transect, formed the basis for a lot of this like political strife that I was thinking about, and that just sort of immersed my daily life as a resident of Arizona. But then I was also trying to write my own transect through that to figure out how I could position myself in relation to those things that were going on.
Since we're a literary podcast, I have to bring up here that a literary and political podcast. The novel Mason and Dixon by Thomas Pynchon. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but it's another book, a really good book about like surveying and the political meaning of surveying and how the Mason-Dixon line was actually drawn and what it meant, and there's a similar process going on there. And so anyway, I thought about that while I was reading your essay. And I think that idea of the physical process of drawing borders, but what that means metaphorically, right, becomes very
Mhm.
complicated.
Yeah, I think it is very complicated. And ultimately, I think I say something very simple, but that took me a long time to figure out in that essay was that just as I don't trust my transect, as I'm skeptical of it, like I don't think it's actually answering anything about my identity or my place in Arizona, that I also shouldn't apply that level of mistrust should also be applicable to the transect that those surveyors ran, right? And that they were themselves also constantly sort of questioning like this gigantic trek that they took from the Gulf of Mexico slash America. I'm just gonna call it the Gulf of Mexico, toward the Pacific. So,
So as I was reading this essay, I was thinking about my friend Peter Ho Davies, who wrote a book called The Fortunes. It's four different connected novellas, which are in part about different time periods in Chinese American life.
hmm,
Um, and also thinking about I had learned about the um, you write about Chinese immigrants being taught by like a specific person to pass themselves off as Mexican. And I had learned about this a few years ago from a friend of mine who's like an immigration historian. But
hmm,
a thing that I didn't realize, which is so fascinating and pretty horrifying, is the connection between the Chinese Exclusion Act and the present day Border Patrol. And of course, we're currently seeing, communities all over the country just in fear of ICE raids. Like at some universities, you're getting instruction on what to do if ICE shows up to your classroom. Workers in California are not showing up for work. In Chicago, Pete Homan is mad that people know too much about their rights. Um, can you talk a little bit about how the Chinese Exclusion Act led to the concept of so-called illegal immigration?
yeah, of course. And this is something that I was also super naive about until I started reading into the history of the border. And the immediate tie-in was, learning, and this is on the Border Patrol's, I think, own website, that early on before it was like constituted as like a as an official agency even, they referred to it as the Chinese division, right? And it was more localized, but it was specifically there to stop the border crossers that mattered, at least in public consciousness at that moment in time, were migrants from China that, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, were different from prior and also contemporary migrants of that time, and that they were suddenly now by law not supposed to be there. And this is very complicated because it's like at the time and prior to the Exclusion Act, like migration had been happening and it had been connected to moralizing and discrimination. So one thing I want to be clear about is that I'm not saying like, oh, like the Chinese were the first to carry all the negative connotations of being an illegal immigrant. I think what the history reveals is something more like legalistic than that, right? Like, it wasn't that the Chinese were welcomed before the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it wasn't that like Mexicans migrating across the border weren't under duress as well. It was quite simply that there wasn't anything on the books that was saying this class of immigrant from this nation of origin is not allowed in this country, and therefore for them to cross the border is breaking the law of the land, right? And this just brings into stark parallel, I feel like, um, uh, uh, just like how contingent these terms are to the time, right? Like illegal immigrant, and I think about this in my conversations with like Asian Americans in my own community, right? Where like a lot of them, um, whether they're political or not, I think they have this imagination that they've always been the good immigrants, or like if they weren't the good immigrants, that's like so it was like it was all the bad of like the US government. And for some reason they draw like a tight distinction between their sort of immigration history in this country and the current sort of immigration crisis going on and all the political rhetoric around it. And so for me, both for my own personal edification and just like almost so that I could talk with some evidence to people in my life who think like this, I, you know, like that really succinctly tied it together for me. Like, no, like for long periods of Chinese migration to this country, we were illegal immigrants and laden with all the like kind of baggage and xenophobia that comes along with that. So,
I mean, illegal immigrant is a political term,
mhm,
and it means what the people who are in charge of politics decide that it means at the time that they're having the power to enforce quote unquote immigration law. I mean, there are plenty of illegal immigrants in certain areas of New York who are Russian. They are not right now part of the illegal immigration that Trump is talking about, right? Even though
mhm.
technically,
But they might get caught up in it, which is also like what I think we own. I mean, I don't know anything about that, but like I think
yeah.
it goes back to the blunt force thing. Like you just can't tell really like what
Well, but
it
I
could.
think they're not going to be because I don't think that's who the president's interested in deporting, you know?
Yeah.
Anyway, and that's about naming. This is another kind of naming that, as we were talking about at the beginning of the show. Speaking of maps, I wanted to go back to that essay, Queer Cartographies, which you mentioned in the beginning of this interview, which is about mapping and making visible queer life in America. We're recording on January 29th. Just today, Scripps and other news outlets are reporting that the Trump administration is set to sign an executive order that would ban K through 12 schools from teaching quote unquote critical race theory and quote unquote gender ideology. There are a lot of details on this. The order's not out yet. I think it's based on a memo that like the Daily Caller is reporting that it has in its possession. But this kind of order and others that Trump has already made, like banning diversity, equity, inclusion programs from federal government, seem bent on making the LGBTQ population less visible, right?
Mhm.
And I wanted to talk about how those kinds of acts might or will change the country's queer cartography.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think it's hard probably for any of us, but definitely for me to feel like I have any handle on this. Like it's happening so fast and you sort of feel like any one thing you say might be contradicted to me. But so I think for the purposes of just like making it
So
less
we'll
abstract and
stipulate that
more,
we're all guessing right now. We
yeah,
don't
yeah,
know. We're
of
not holding you
course.
to anything.
But just to make it like more local and more concrete to me, I'll say that like, I teach at the University of Idaho right now. Um, and the one of the big things that's happening, and this is happening at universities across the country, is this huge anti-DEI backlash that is also kind of coming in concert with anti-LGBTQ activism and thinking as well. And so the Idaho legislature is like very recently passed a resolution to the effect of like, we can no longer talk about gender identity with our students. That's stipulated on it. It's also stipulated that like the Women's Center, for instance, which is also kind of the center on campus that LGBTQ students have certain services through, has been officially closed. It's going to be renamed something more to do with like the American experience,
Oh
something,
my God.
that isn't flagged as DI. So like this is like it's both happening really fast and it's also like very real and just happening right now. And as someone who teaches queer literature and things that might fly under the banner of critical race theory sometimes, it is something that I'm really just trying to wrap my brain around. So like I think the blunt answer to what you were saying, like the changing of queer cartographies is like it's closing down some of those spaces where there's like a public weaving of like queer identity into large institutions that certainly aren't, like queer exclusive spaces, but that had room or were like, at least in name, making room for those identities, right? And I think we could go
Including
back and forth.
libraries. You mentioned in one of your essays, I can't remember if there's this one or one later one, about the importance of being able to go to urban libraries and
Yeah.
read gay authors like Alan Hollinghurst or other people that you were first encountering.
Yeah, and like having those books taken off, whether it's syllabi or library books, I think it does have this like long-term huge ripple effect that is like devastating to think about. Um, I think and that's sort of like where in the essay I land too, because I'm thinking about this really beautiful online queer map, right? Called Queering the Map, that was designed by a Canadian designer named Lucas LaRochelle. And it's just this pink global map that looks like Google Maps, but is like covered in stories. Some of them like really funny, some explicit, some incredibly sad, that are just like I mean like kind of repeatedly making the very simple insistence that we exist, that we are here, but in putting it on the map, it kind of makes that more tangible, I feel like, right? But I think the sadness behind that essay is that I don't necessarily think that's a replacement for things like the women's center that I just mentioned. It sounds more boring than this like online queer map that collects all these stories, but it's also physical and it's like a gathering place for people to be together IRL, And maybe this is like my own latent, like just suspicion of technology. But I think in that essay, I'm really thinking about how a lot of queer space making has just necessarily moved online. I mean, I was writing this in the midst of the pandemic when there was a whole spate of news stories and elegies to queer clubs, mostly gay male clubs being closed, and this sort of like panic, which has subsided, but those spaces have not returned, right? And like in the same way. I think some have certainly come back in little areas, but there was this kind of mass closure. And so, what became a substitute were like things like querying the map and things like I remember at that time seeing like an ad from Google trying to sell a phone, but it was all these queer people trying to sell their Pixel, and it was like you can find community through buying this Google phone and joining Google group things. And, I'm not so much of a cynic that I don't think that those things are important. They're certainly more important than not having community. But I'm kind of a brick and mortar person in many ways. And that's, I think, the bigger change in queer cartography that's happening kind of independent even from what Trump is doing. And what Trump is doing certainly, though, is not, I think, going to turn the tide on that.
I wonder if like one of the things it seems like I'm seeing is increasing anxiety about sort of like the need to be in some people's perceived need to be in the closet, like more and more, right? To be clocked as a trans person, to be out as queer, et cetera, et cetera. Like I'm seeing sort of more and more anxiety around that, concern about um being one own self, which is like, of course, the fundamental act of naming. And that seems like one of the things that that's harder in physical space, like it's more vulnerable. And that's so much of what the online space does, but it does also
Yeah.
remove that intimacy and connection that you're talking about. I feel like I hear my friends who are queer or trans or who have children or who are queer or trans really worrying about kind of the ways in which identity is revealed and not revealed. Yeah, I um it's very disturbing. And yeah, I'm the chair of our English department's EDI committee. It's a really
Mm.
weird time to be doing that work and to think about what is the right way to be doing that work. In thinking about passing, when I kind of pivot for our last question to talk to you about the title essay of the book. Um, you write about the white poet Michael Derrick Hudson, who I think our listeners probably know who he is, who used the nom de plume of Yi Fen Chu to publish a poem that was in Best American Poetry the year that Sherman Alexie was editing it. And this was partly, as you write, because Sherman Alexie was intrigued by a poem by a writer with a Chinese name that had nothing, quote unquote, like ostensibly Chinese in the poem.
Hmm.
Um, and of course, you also write about choosing to go by Thomas rather than the Chinese name your parents gave you. I have to say, I think that the name your parents gave you is so cool in its Americanness because it actually honors Knoxville.
Yeah.
And tell me if I'm saying it correctly. It's No Cheng.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And that is, I don't know. I kind of love the hidden, not hidden, really, if you speak Chinese, presumably, like the hidden Americanness of it, the fact that it has that layer in it that um, people might not expect of a Chinese name. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how writing is understood through the lens of names and the ways in which that sort of reading can fail. I mean, you also say that like that is a name that you have no particular plans to publish under that name or go by it. You write about it and its history in here, but it's for all purposes sort of not how you identify.
Yeah. I mean, I think your question is really just getting me to like the I mean, I'm thinking about like the McKinley Denali thing from earlier too, and like how place names are so singular, and maybe that's how they feel so final. Like, we're not hyphenating it. I mean, I guess there would be a world where we could hyphenate it and like add, but like with personal names, you do just have this multiplicity, and they almost feel like different directions you could take, right? And like for me in that essay, at least, like over identifying with Thomas or just going by it is this practical thing for just like whatever. It's like I I I I don't want to constantly be explaining how to pronounce my name or something like that. But also I think on a deeper level, I felt like what I was writing about there was that like in choosing to go by Thomas, I was sort of doing what like Michael Derrick Hudson did in reverse though. It was like a leaning into assimilation, right? And maybe yeah, one of the positive byproducts of that I as a writer, I'm sort of selfishly thinking about it is like, yeah, it like creates a legible, you get your name in print or whatever, something like that. But honestly, I think more deeper than it was a reflection of just something that I've been doing my entire life, which is molding myself into the shape of someone who presumably could be a Thomas or go by Thomas, right? Um, but then on the other hand, I still do have that Chinese name. And even though I don't use it, it's in my middle name. Like it is on my documents to an extent. And in the process of writing this book, I wasn't I wasn't recovering that name per se, but I was like the book ended up becoming very much about kind of exactly what my Chinese name about is that it combines a character for Knoxville with a character for Chengdu, which is like the city in China that my mother grew up in, which I also ended up spending a year living in as a kind of listless American expat. And that's kind of like encapsulating that name is sort of the journey of the whole book, like searching for personal identity and then searching for personal identity through, for me, a very obvious way because it's baked into my name and my identifier through like exploring these places that have both been incredibly important to me and that have also just like kind of held me on this string in between them, I feel like, for my entire life, at least psychically and also geographically. And I think that was the experience. I didn't want to resolve that gap. I didn't want to have some, I'm not letting go of either one of those names. But I think part of the point of that essay is like you have to think about it. Like it isn't something that you should just take on and assume it means nothing. It means a lot both for how you're read by the external world and also ideally for how you know yourself, right? And maybe this is a way of looping back to the beginning where I feel like part of this sort of like bluntness of how the renaming happens in the political realm is it just feels so careless in many ways or just like so simplistic and just evades so much the deep thinking. I know I'm just like hard. I just sound like an annoying professor person who's like, you just need to think about it more. But I do just feel like that is my task now, pedagogically and otherwise. It's like to get my students certainly to like think about these things and hopefully in their little ways also be able to like make their own claims to personal identity whether that's through names or place or just something else entirely.
Well, here at the podcast, we're definitely in favor of thinking about it more rather than less. And we're glad that you could join us to help us do that. Listeners, you can find Take My Name But Say It Slow by Thomas Dai at an independent bookstore near you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.